Kia ora koutou katoa, i ngā iwi, i ngā mana, i ngā reo, i ngā hoa whā, i kui mā, e koro mā. Te whānau a Local Government New Zealand, nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to you all to the Sustainable Funding for Local Governments session, hugely significant session, and off the backdrop of what I thought was a very encouraging contribution from the Prime Minister yesterday. We are joined here by Penny Webster, Councillor from the Auckland Council, and Penny is the chair of the Funding Review Working Party. I want to acknowledge you, Penny. We're also here with Hugo, Ellis, a partner from Cameron Partners Limited, and also Oliver Hartwich, who's Chief Executive of the New Zealand Initiative. I just want to make a couple of opening comments before I introduce them. I'll facilitate this and give Malcolm a bit of a break. Firstly, I want to tell you a very short story which sort of encapsulates the sense of the challenge that we have got in funding sustainably local government going forward. My view is the system is broke and needs serious fixing. It is based purely on unfairness. Secondly, it is unsustainable. And thirdly, it's very complicated. It was all wrapped up in a discussion I had with a local businessman. I was out visiting the community in Birkenhead a couple of days ago. And I bumped into a young businessman operating a restaurant. And his question to me was, Len, why are my rates going up 100%? Can you please explain that to me? He has a place in Beach Haven. 3 years ago, it was valued at $350,000. It is now revalued at $800,000. I said, with a 130% increase in the value of your property, your rates have risen well above the norm, but because you've had such a significant increase, you are going to pay a lot more rates. He said, but I've got no further income than what I had 3 years ago, marginal increase, and my outgoings are slightly increased. How can this be the case? That type of a sense of the unfairness, the inherent unfairness of this is reflected even worse amongst those who are elderly, who have for many, many years, decades, and this is the same in every single one of your communities, own properties long term, arrive at the point of retirement, have a flatlining or even declining income, but at the same time they find themselves with increasing rate bills as a consequence of their property value going up. No connectivity or very little connectivity between their ability to pay and what they actually pay us as their contribution to local government. So there are two issues that we need to address and have been addressing through the funding review, and that we'll hear from our contributors today. The first issue is the broader issue of how we sustainably fund local government against the backdrop of two dichotomies within New Zealand. Either a shrinking rating base as a consequence of a demographic that's changing with downward population trends in the towns and cities of some parts of this country, or secondly, continue an increase in the economic growth, development, population of it, with a burgeoning rating base, but not enough to meet, as in the case of our city, the challenges that are required to have a sustainable infrastructure growth to meet the needs of the growth in your population and your economy. I want to acknowledge, therefore, firstly, as our contributor to this most critical discussion, Councillor Penny Webster. It's not often that in front of your peers and your colleagues, I get the opportunity to acknowledge a political colleague of mine. You can imagine that in the bringing together of Auckland over the last 5 years against the backdrop of uniting 8 budgets and then amalgamating in a rating base and dealing with the sorts of comments, queries and concerns that you read about day in, day out as people reflect on Auckland's challenges, successful or otherwise, that in the middle of that is a small group of people being led by Penny who manage the political finances of our council. I want to say before all of you, she has done an outstanding job, and therefore it's my real pleasure to ask Penny to come and speak to you first. Councillor Penny Webster.
Thank you, Len. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had some amazing, inspiring speakers this morning, challenging us to do all sorts of things. But of course, at the end of the day, it comes down to money. I can remember when I first got in as Federated Farmers Auckland President, my very first speech was talking about rates and the rating system and the way farmers didn't get any services from government, local councils, but we all had to pay extremely high rates, and actually said that maybe Maggie Thatcher had been on the right track. That was in the 90s, and here we are today, now still talking about funding infrastructure and funding local government. For New Zealand to succeed, our local communities must succeed. A key role for local government is to support our local communities to thrive by providing high-quality services, whether rubbish collection, effective public transport, or economic development. But the delivery of these services to a high standard requires a consistent and high standard of funding, something which local government is struggling. Our funding system, based as it is on property rates and user fees, is not broken, but due to economic and demographic changes, requires more tools and resources to deliver those services our communities and our partners demand. Local Government New Zealand think the time is right to explore some different funding options so that we can continue to deliver those high quality services, even as these communities change, some growing, others declining. We need to face these changes head on by exploring innovative solutions and including our communities, the private sector and central government in our conversation. We face a number of challenges. Our communities have significant expectations of us in what we provide and how we provide it. Central government too has significant expectations, requiring councils to implement regulations for resources and services such as drinking water and earthquake-prone buildings. Many of our communities are experiencing significant demographic change. Councils with growing populations have to deal with significant capital expenditure requirements so that infrastructure keeps up with growth, and councils with declining populations need to continue to deliver services and to maintain and renew underutilised infrastructure, all with a limited rating base. Auckland is one council that is facing significant challenges in dealing with the infrastructure needs of a growing population. The Special Housing Area project goes some way towards lessening Auckland's housing crisis, but it creates its own issues with regard to infrastructure, especially in historically rural areas, such as the Prime Minister's own electorate, where local government is responsible for funding new water and sewerage networks. Plus, it shares the cost of roading and most public transport services with central government. Auckland is badly affected by road congestion and hampered by historical underinvestment in public transport. With a total population likely to be more than 2 million people by 2030, solutions to these are needed urgently, and current funding systems are unlikely to be able to support these. Councils with declining populations face the challenge of right-sizing their infrastructure and services to fit the current and future populations. As populations decline, local services, especially those offset by user charges, such as leisure facilities, become unsustainable. Rangitikei District is one council who has risen to the challenge of a declining population. Their work on planning for population decline has resulted in some likely changes to infrastructure funding, including a smaller urban water and wastewater reticulation network and the transfer of some facilities into community ownership. Christchurch City Council faces its own unique challenges. The aftermath of the earthquake has required and continues to require substantial rebuilding of amenities and infrastructure. The cost-sharing agreement between Christchurch City Council and the Crown goes some way towards dealing with these costs, but some tough choices have been and need to be made about council projects and services to retain. More tools and resources are needed to address all these diverse challenges faced by our councils. Our diversity, both between councils and the work we do, requires us to look beyond the one-size-fits-all model and to explore other means of financing this work. Councils will need to be courageous and to explore innovative measures beyond the standard property rating system. We need to embrace innovation, and we've heard a lot about that this morning, so that we can move forward and deliver high-quality services to our constituents. In doing so, we should explore the huge scope for collaboration between local government and the private sector, community groups and central government. A strategic partnership between local and central government is essential to meet the needs of our local communities and New Zealand as a whole. At present, local and central government largely operate in their own distinct spheres and cross paths only at the end of an initiative. This is something local authorities will recognise from the National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management from that experience, in which local authorities' views were not sought until late in the process, despite the significant implications for councils in infrastructure investment. As central government really shares its costs imposed on local government, there is little incentive for national policymakers to consider the effects of policy on local authorities. At the same time, central government expectations of local authorities have resulted in an increasing cost burden, with councils having to make tough choices about increased rates or reduction in other council activities in order to bear these imposed costs. Maybe after listening to the Prime Minister yesterday, this attitude is changing. However, there are some policy areas where central and local government have collaborated with some good results. We can see the emergence of a partnership approach through the National Land Transport Fund, where central government makes an overall investment rate of 53% for roads across the country. What could we achieve if we extended the spirit of this partnership to other aspects of local government? Which is why it was so good to see those remits went through yesterday about water and wastewater. A partnership approach would require central government to fully consider the costs and benefits of decisions for local government and to co-fund costs where policy proposals have significant national as well as local benefit. A partnership approach would also require central government to allow local government to explore other funding options beyond the current property rating framework, even where these impact on central government revenue. This would recognise that local projects can have a national benefit and allow for more effective delivery of projects in a locally responsive view. One obvious avenue for change is within our existing rating framework. As the Productivity Commission has noted in its draft report of June 2015, there appears no principled reason for the exemption of core Crown land from rates. The exemption of this land from rates has significant impact for local councils, and we heard some of those yesterday, in its narrowing of the rating base. A departure from the established statutory exemption system has great potential for additional funding source for local government, either by the land becoming rateable in the same way as other land, or by a grant being paid to the local authority in lieu of rates. There is also room for innovation in the taxation space. Currently, tax revenue from land sale profits where land has been rezoned is retained by government. If this revenue was to be reallocated to local authorities in the area where the profit was earned, this would provide much needed funding for local authorities who have contributed to that increase in land value through infrastructure investment. The same principles are relevant also to extractive industries such as oil, gas, coal and mineral mining. These industries benefit from the local infrastructure such as roads, services and amenities, yet local authorities don't receive any direct contribution towards keeping this infrastructure and these services in good shape. This disparity has been addressed in Western Australia, where Royalties for the Regions program provides funding for local government to meet critical infrastructure needs which have resulted from resource sector activity, such as water and sewerage, roads and flood mitigation projects. In 2012-13, the New Zealand Government revenue from minerals industry amounted to $424 million. For local authorities to receive some of this revenue would recognise that the infrastructure and amenities they provide help contribute to the success of this sector and to help keep this infrastructure and amenities in good shape. Central government could also free up options for local government in relation to user charges. For example, the Waitomo District Council has raised concerns about the impact of road sealing on local residents and businesses. The council is under pressure to seal the road that leads to the local section of the National Cycleway for the benefit of tourists who are not usually permitted to drive on unsealed roads. The status quo would require the council to finance this project from rates raised from local residents and businesses, whereas the ability to direct charge the road users to cover the costs would mean that those who use it, the tourists, would bear the cost. Local councils also face significant challenges from recent changes to the development contributions. Development contributions can now only be charged for infrastructure that is directly related to the development in question, preventing councils from levying a charge towards community infrastructure. Auckland Council, in its submission on these legislative changes, noted that this change will result in an additional rate requirement of $160 million over the next 10 years. Beyond partnership with central government, there are a number of other effective options for increasing funding for local councils. Partnership principles can be extended to local authorities' relationships with communities, business, and indeed other local authorities. A great example of inter-council collaboration can be seen in the Bay of Plenty, where the Smart Growth Spatial Plan for Western Bay of Plenty region is helping local councils, tangata whenua, businesses, central government and the wider community work together towards a shared vision and direction for the region. This collaboration is helping avoid duplication of effort and making the best use of resources. In Auckland, the council and community collaboration has been led to the establishment of a walkway and cycleway linking the communities of Matakana, Point Wells and Omaha. The project received funding support from the Rodney District Council and subsequently from the Rodney Local Board, as well as substantial input from fundraising by the Matakana community. Further savings came from donations of time, materials and machinery from local businesses. The walkway has benefits for both tourists and locals, making walking and cycling safer and opening up access to the region's beautiful vineyards, beaches and views. But we ran into a problem when we needed a bridge, but I'm sure Auckland Transport will sort that one out for me. Further afield, the 9 Elms project aims to transform an industrial London area into a new residential and commercial district. The project is run by the 9 Elms Vauxhall Partnership and overseen by the Strategy Board, a body made up of Wandsworth and Lambeth borough councils, the Mayor of London's office, and major landowners in the area. Central government has jumped on board, lending $1 billion to help finance an extension of the tube. Through the Embassy Gardens development, part of the 9 Elms project, Wandsworth Borough Council will gain between £52 and £55 million towards local transport and infrastructure, and has helped to share £40 million of extra profit if value of the development improves during the building period. Private-public partnership is another avenue for critical infrastructure needs. In Wellington, the New Zealand Transport Agency signed a public-private partnership contract with Wellington Gateway Partnership. Under the terms of the PPP contract, the Wellington Gateway Partnership will design, construct and finance, operate and maintain the new Transmission Gully motorway for 25 years that will follow the expected 5-year build to build the motorway. It is aimed to have the motorway open for traffic in 2020, which is another issue for local and central government. Why does it take so long? Targeted levies and taxes are another option for increasing local council funding. Innovation by Southland District Council has resulted in more than $100,000 being in funding to Stewart Island communities through the Stewart Island Rakiau Visitor Levy, which charges those arriving by ferry, plane or cruise ship $5 built into the cost of their tickets. Izzy, maybe that's something you need to look at. This funding has gone towards upgrading walking tracks, footpaths, jetties, and towards the construction of the new heritage centre on the island. Levies such as these have low compliance and enforcement costs and reduce the burden on residents for funding services used by visitors. With the funding challenges we face, councils have much to consider, but a number of options for a way forward. Some we can implement on our own, some in partnership with communities, business, or other peers, our peers in other councils. Others will require central government to jump on board and work with us to deliver the projects for local and national benefit. There is no silver bullet, but both pathways will require us to be courageous and innovative, and I look forward to seeing what we can achieve when we take these steps. Thank you.
Actually, in acknowledging Penny, I want to acknowledge the members of the Working Party who really have spent the last year since the last conference doing an outstanding job in preparing the funding review. So can we please put our hands together for all of those members of the Working Party in support of Penny and the team. Thank you. Our next speaker is Oliver Hartwich, and Oliver will be known to you as being very much an innovative thinker and a contributor in this very specialised space of economic growth and development and infrastructure spend in our nation. He's the Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative and has a very broad base of international experience. He was a research fellow at the Centre for Independent Studies in Sydney, the chief economist at Policy Exchange in London, and an advisor in the UK House of Lords. Oliver, it's a real pleasure to have you to speak to us today. Everyone put your hands together, please, for Oliver Hartwich.
Thank you, Len. Thank you for these very kind words of introduction. I would like to start with a personal remark and a personal thank you to Malcolm Alexander and his team at LGNZ. Malcolm and I, we started our jobs, I think, on exactly the same day 3 years ago. And Malcolm, of course, came from a completely different industry background, and I actually came from a different country altogether. What we heard was that apparently our predecessors probably didn't get on too well. Our predecessors constantly clashed, the organizations constantly clashed, and we heard about all of these confrontations in the past. When Malcolm and I first met, we discussed them. But with Malcolm and me, it's actually been the complete opposite. We do get on a personal level, and I'm very proud to announce that since 7:40 a.m. this morning, we follow each other on Twitter. I'm Malcolm's 13th follower, I think that's lucky. But more importantly, the organizations get on. So over the past 3 years, the New Zealand Initiative and LGNZ, we have cooperated quite closely on a number of projects because we have realized that we are sharing the same goals. We may be very different organizations. LGNZ, of course, represents all councils in the country. We represent a number of large businesses. But really, we share very similar goals. We are all committed to creating a more vibrant New Zealand, more prosperous communities, a growing economy. And we think we are all in this together, whether you're a council or a business. And that's why we think we should closely cooperate. And I just want to thank Malcolm and his team for the great cooperation and indeed friendship between the two organizations that's developed over the past 3 years. And I want to congratulate you on the fantastic work that you're doing at LGNZ. So I was naturally delighted when Malcolm asked me whether I wanted to become part of this local government funding review. And I cannot give anything away today, at least not the details of this funding review, because the document will only be launched officially tomorrow. What I can say, though, is that it is a very, very good contribution to the debate. It is bold, it has a clear vision, maybe it even has a dream. And in some ways, if these recommendations are accepted by government, it could be quite revolutionary. Again, I can only compliment LGNZ on this funding review. It was well conducted, it was a fantastic process. It brought together stakeholders from very different backgrounds, from academia, local government, of course, business, lobby groups, and we all shared the same goal, to find answers to the pressing challenges that local government faces, and especially the pressing challenges of local government finance. So once again, I can only congratulate LGNZ on the review process, and I'm happy to endorse the review in the spirit of its recommendations. But as I said, because I cannot comment specifically on the recommendations, you will all find out more tomorrow morning. I just want to give you some general observations on the state of local government and on the state of local government finance in New Zealand. The first observation is something that I spoke to you a couple of years ago about at the LGNZ conference 2013 in Hamilton. And the first observation I have on local government in New Zealand is that it is a very centralized way of government in New Zealand. If you look around the OECD, you will only find 2 countries that are more centralized for government spending, more centralized than New Zealand. If you were there 2 years ago, you would know these countries. For all the others, the 2 countries I'm talking about are Ireland and Greece. Now, they are probably not the best benchmark, which is to say that we've got a bit of a problem in New Zealand, because out of every dollar that government spends, 91 cents are spent by central government in Wellington, 9 cents are spent by you, councils. If you look across the OECD, you see that the average is actually about a 2/3, 1/3 split. So 2/3 typically spent by central governments and 1/3 by sub-central tiers of government. Some countries, of course, have federal structures, so you've got states or cantons, and then, of course, there are councils. But we are quite far off the international average. And there are, of course, countries that have it completely the other way around. If you look at Switzerland, the Swiss national government spends about 10% of GDP, or just under 1/3 of all government spending in Switzerland. So New Zealand is clearly an outlier, and it's probably not following best international practice unless you take Greece as an example. The other way in which New Zealand local government is quite unusual internationally is it's in its high dependence on property taxes. Now, we all know, you all know, that we are very dependent on the rate system for your revenue, and that the majority of your revenue comes from property taxes. Now, again, if you look around the OECD, what you do see is that this is quite an unusual setup. In most other OECD economies, you can find that local government actually gets its revenue from a number of sources, different sources. We all know that in America, for example, sales taxes are quite widespread and a widespread mechanism of funding local government. In some European countries, for example in Switzerland, there are local and cantonal income taxes. But in any case, it is very unusual to just put all your eggs in one basket and say, well, this is the dominant factor of funding local government. But that's exactly what New Zealand does, of course. So we've got 2 factors here. We've got a very centralized way of government, and we've got a way of funding local government which is really almost exclusively reliant on property taxation. Why does this matter and why is it a problem? Well, it is a problem because it doesn't quite comply with a fundamental economic concept. You know, if you want to sum up the whole body of economics in just one word, what would it be? It wouldn't be supply and demand because there are three words. It would be incentives. There's nothing more important in economics than incentives. And if you've got a local government system that is set up as New Zealand's, unfortunately the incentives do not work too well. And I just want to explain a little bit what I mean, not by taking a New Zealand example, but an overseas example so nobody feels too overly offended. I did some research about a decade ago when I worked in Britain on housing affordability and what could be done about it. And in the course of this research, I interviewed a councillor from the county of Kent. And we wanted to figure out how this councillor responds to the population pressures of Britain and specifically the Greater London region and Kent, and what approach he took to growing his council and to growing the county and accepting more people. And we got a very frank and honest answer off the record. And this councillor told me, if only we got away with it, we would build a wall around Kent to stop people from moving in. Why? Because British councils were 75% financed by central government grants, and they didn't really fluctuate with population figures. So for him, it was perfectly rational to say that growth should really stop on the borders of Kent, and people wishing to move in, well, rather go to Sussex or Essex or Wessex or anywhere, but not Kent, because he made a very simple calculation. These people, once they arrived, cost him money, because he had to provide infrastructure, and as you all know, that is extremely expensive. These people also caused him some political troubles, because, of course, in Kent, as anywhere else, there are NIMBYs and bananas, not in my backyard, and built absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. So it was a political cost of accepting this extra development. But what was the upside? Well, the upside was there was no upside, because he was dependent on central government grants. If he was lucky, he would get the central government grant updated after a few years, but he couldn't bank on that, and therefore for him it was perfectly rational to say no to any kind of development. And that's the power of incentives. So when you've got a system that is set up like the British system, or actually the New Zealand system, and there's probably some link between the two, you shouldn't be too surprised that it doesn't provide incentives for economic development. It doesn't provide the kind of jurisdictional competition either that we can see in a number of other OECD economies, jurisdictional competition where neighboring councils actually compete for inhabitants, compete for businesses. Because why would you compete if there's nothing in it for you? You would actually try to push development out, away from your council area, because let the others bear the costs and let the others provide the infrastructure. You wouldn't actually want to see these extra people there. And that is certainly something that we saw in the course of the research in Britain, but also when I did some research in Australia. I'm not quite sure how much of a problem it is here, but in any case, if it was a problem, it would be entirely rational because the incentives are simply not there. So we believe that we need a completely different approach to local government finance and to government finance more generally. And what I mean by that, I can explain by just simplifying the issue. Imagine the national economy grows. Well, that's what we would all like to see. What happens to central government's finances when the national economy grows? Well, obviously, we're all paying more tax. We're paying more income tax, we're paying more corporate taxes, we're paying more GST. So for central government, economic growth is a wonderful thing when it happens, because the finance minister's coffers, they will be filled, and there will be more money to spend. There will actually be, in some ways, is an even better news story, because at the same time, expenditure probably for central government tends to go down when the economy grows, because you have to pay out fewer benefits. So the net effect on central government when it comes to economic growth is overwhelmingly positive. So of course, central government would like to grow the economy. Now, what happens for local government when a local economy grows? Well, when a local economy grows, what it basically means for local government is that you have increased expenditure. You have to spend more. You have to spend more on the roads, on water, sewage. You have to accommodate that growth, and as we all know, this is extremely costly to you. What happens to your revenue side? Well, not much really, because rates revenue doesn't fluctuate with the growing economy. Whether your local economy stagnates or falls or grows, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't make a big impact on your budget. So we think, in all likelihood, the effect of economic growth on local government might be negative. Well, and if the effect of economic growth on a local budget is negative, why would you want to make it happen? So we see a dichotomy really between central government and local government, where one tier of government pushes for growth because it pays for central government, and where the other part basically pays for it when it happens. And we think that's unfair. We think that local government really deserves a better deal. And it deserves a better deal in the interest of the whole country, because if we don't fix this, then you will always find local government working against central government and vice versa. We think under an ideal system, what you should be doing is you should have both tiers of government working in sync, working together. And we think it is possible to achieve this kind of arrangement. You just have to look to other countries, how they have done it. Look at Switzerland, for example, where there is a local income tax, or a cantonal income tax even. It basically means that when the economy grows, it actually benefits all tiers of government. It benefits central government, it benefits local government. And that's why both can actually work hand in hand to make it happen. In this way, I believe we can also serve the housing affordability crisis, because one of the reasons why housing is simply not developed enough and why we're struggling with the supply of housing is because there is very little in it of economic, in terms of extra revenue for local government when it happens. So this whole local government funding review that we have conducted is really under the headline of incentivizing economic growth and compensating local communities for when growth happens. Because we think for local government, economic growth shouldn't just be an unpleasant, costly nuisance. It should be something that actually benefits communities. It should be something that you can take to your communities and argue the case for. You could then argue to the NIMBYs and bananas of this world that when we make this project happen, when we make this residential development project happen, when we actually manage to grow our local economy, there is something in it for you. And we can also finance the required infrastructure of this new economic development out of the extra taxes we are going to collect. So in this way, we could solve a number of issues. We think this country deserves a better system for local government finance. We think that you, as councillors and mayors, you deserve a better deal. Our communities deserve a better deal. And that's why we think we need a radical reform of local government finance. We need this to create and stimulate development. We need it to compensate for infrastructure spending. And this is why I recommend this funding review, and this is why I would like to invite you all to have a look at the document, discuss it, because this country really needs a radical discussion about radical reform of local government finance. The country, you deserve a better deal. Thank you.
Excellent, Oliver. An excellent compliment to Penny and the work of the Funding Working Party. Some very innovative work there. I particularly like the revenue sharing one, Oliver. I want to encourage now to the microphone representative from Cameron Partners, Hugo Ellis. Bob Cameron was very much at the front end of the early work that we were doing with regard to the review, and Hugo has contributed in his stead. And it's very good to see you here, Hugo. 20 years experience in investment and banking amongst his clients, Christchurch City Holdings, NZ Post, Meridian Energy, TVNZ, amongst many others. Hugo, we are looking forward to hearing from you in your discourse on the internal workings of how we might better leverage stretch budgets. Ladies and gentlemen, Hugo Ellis.
Thanks, Len. And as Len said, I wasn't intimately involved in what happened with, or what's been the work that's been done with Local Government New Zealand, but I have got a lot of experience and have worked with Rob advising local government over a number of years. Back in 2009, 2011, we led the establishment of the Local Government Funding Agency. We've advised many CCTOs over the years, and most recently we've been advising Auckland Council and Christchurch City Council. One of the key things that we do is take a lot of complex information and try and break it down into bite-sized bits and put frameworks around things so that people can understand them and at least agree on a framework if they can't necessarily agree on what the answer might end up being. And just in terms of context to what I'm intending to talk about today, which is releasing capital from the CCTOs, I want to talk about what we've grouped into 4 levers, the 4 levers that councils have to balance budgets. And we see the levers being, firstly, 1 which relates to the expenditure that councils undertake, and then 3 funding levers. And the first one is really the opportunity to change the plan that councils have. And I think it was Lester Levy talked about, a plan is really just the way that you get a strategy or a vision completed. And so ultimately councils will have a view or a vision for their city, and the plan is really how they go about implementing that vision and strategy. So in terms of balancing the budget, the plan obviously has a lot of costs, and they need to be balanced ultimately. And the way councils can achieve that is really by changing the plan. But what that means is reducing the costs or the expenditure that they're undertaking, and that could be OPEX or CAPEX. And the implication of that is a lower level of services, and that's ultimately what councils are there to provide, essential services, public services. So reducing expenditure ultimately or typically means that there'll be less services available. So that's always fraught as a lever in terms of balancing budgets. The other 3 levers that councils have are increasing revenue, that's through increasing rates, increasing debt, or releasing capital from existing assets. Now, I think as most councils know, having just undertaken long-term planning processes and consultation, increasing revenue from ratepayers and other users is a pretty fraught process as well. It turns out that ratepayers do care about how high their rates are, and so do users about what charges they're going to have to pay. Increasing debt it's a very valuable tool. Ultimately, it's a function of revenue though. So most local authorities these days borrow through the LGFA. The LGFA has financial covenants that it imposes on local authorities, and the key constraint that the local government funding agency imposes is a net debt to revenue ratio, which is 250%. So basically, a local authority can only borrow 2.5 times the amount of revenue that it generates. So ultimately that's a finite lever that a local authority has. It is very useful, though it does enable the costs of infrastructure to be spread across generations, which is a valuable tool. And then the fourth lever that local authorities have is releasing capital from assets that they may own, and we're thinking explicitly or specifically about the CCTOs that they own. And the recent work that we've done for Christchurch City Council has been focused on their CCTOs. How can they release capital from the CCTOs? I mean, Christchurch is in a very difficult situation. It's obviously experienced 2 major earthquakes and a series of other earthquakes, and they're in the process of rebuilding a city. So they're looking at all options. The budget that they went out to consult on had a 1.2 billion shortfall, and the proposition or the proposal was that they funded 750 million of this from releasing capital from assets. So it's a very important piece of work. Christchurch is lucky. It does have a lot of valuable CCTOs. It owns the majority stake in Orion, the electricity lines business in Christchurch and Canterbury. It owns 75% of the airport, the international airport. It owns 100% of Littleton Port Company, City Care and Red Bus. The process that we've gone through has been very comprehensive. So we've met and engaged with all the CCTOs through the process. We've met and engaged with around 40 potential investors in those assets and their advisors, and we've engaged with council and councillors, so the executive and the councillors themselves. So we've got a pretty good understanding of the different angles that various stakeholders are taking in relation to releasing capital from CCTOs. But I think one of the key observations we'd make about releasing capital is that it causes a lot of angst. I think there's some unhelpful language that often surrounds releasing capital, and that's asset sales. And that is not the only way that that capital can be released from assets. In fact, it's an asset sale tends to suggest a complete sale, and that's not true either. There can be partial sales of assets as well, or partial issuance of equity to raise capital. You can understand why there is an emotional response, though, from councillors to releasing capital from assets or selling assets. I mean, the reason that councils have these assets in the first place is because somewhere, sometime, another generation paid for those assets. So councillors quite rightly see themselves as guardians of those assets. Another reason is that the assets generate income. They pay dividends to councils, and that enables councils to reduce the rates increases that they've got to get through. It gives them revenue to spend on CapEx and OpEx over time. And then the third issue is around the strategic importance of the assets. And I mean, this is a term that's used a lot. The assets are strategic, and therefore we must hang on to them. Now, that's true. They are strategic. Many of these assets provide essential services, key infrastructure for the region. But the key question is, do they need to be owned by councils? And what are the key reasons that council believes they need to own those assets? So, I mean, that's a key issue that I think we've identified and which councillors acknowledge needs to be addressed. In terms of the ways that capital can be released from the assets, there's two key ways. Firstly, there's an internal capital restructuring within those assets. So what I mean by that is those assets or those CCTOs can go out, issue more debt, sell assets, and then distribute the capital back to the council so that the council can use that capital for other purposes. And then there is selling equity. That's the second way. Now, these two options, they're not mutually exclusive. You can do both, but there is a natural order. Because selling equity in an asset is a politically charged decision to make, the first course of action should always be to undertake a capital restructuring, or at least undertake the analysis to decide whether that can occur or not. We see internal capital restructuring, though, as being very much business as usual. I mean, this is the sort of thing that councils and their CCTOs should be undertaking on a regular basis. It's bread and butter stuff. It's about ensuring that the capital structure of those organisations is at an appropriate level based on the business plan. I mean, that CCTO must be able to implement its business plan. It must be able to take advantage of strategic opportunities. But it must also be mindful of the risks. I mean, there's no point stripping capital out of a CCTO if that reduces value, or if it pushes that CCTO towards the point where it's close to being in financial distress. There's no point taking capital out only to have to bail out that asset further down the track. There's also no free lunch with an internal capital restructuring. It's essentially a trade-off. If you take capital out of the business, it means there's less capital in the business to fund dividends over time. So it's really that choice between, is the capital worth more or of more benefit to the council up front, or would it be better to receive that capital over time in a steady dividend stream? Now, clearly the emotional issue is around selling equity in the business, and there's multiple choices and decisions that need to be made around this. We've broken these down into three key categories, and that's decision rights, value or economic rights, and then sale package. And the reason we've done that is ownership confers two key rights to the owner. It gives the owner the decision rights to decide what, where and how that business is going to operate. And it gives economic rights to the owner of the business as well. So that effectively means that the owner of the business has the rights to the residual cash flows that the business generates, or the value that the business has. And in terms of sale package, the reason that those decision rights and economic rights are important to a council is exactly the same reasons why economic rights and decision rights are going to be important to a potential investor or another owner of that business. So if a council, once it's done, looked at all its levers and done its internal capital restructuring, decides that it does want to sell equity in one of its CCTOs, it needs to ensure that it's got the best sale package available that it can take to potential investors in that CCTO, because selling a stake, a small stake with limited decision rights, will generate a lower dollar per share than if full control and a larger stake was sold to an investor. So when we look at decision rights, why do councils want decision rights? Is it because they think they can operate the business well? Is it because they, exactly what it is? And I guess we'd challenge councillors and councils to really define clearly why it is that they feel they need decision rights in relation to a specific asset or CCTO. For example, in Christchurch, the port company has gone through a lot of change. It's clearly got a lot of issues, a lot of strategic issues, a lot of rebuild issues that need to be addressed. And it'll be up for the council to decide what it does there, but you could see a valid reason why they'd want to hang on to that is because they want to ensure that that asset gets up and starts performing as well as it possibly can. So it may decide that it needs those decision rights and therefore it doesn't want to sell the asset at this stage, or it doesn't want to sell it at all, full stop. In terms of decision rights, there are standard decision rights and there are alternative arrangements that can be put in place as well. So standard decision rights relate to the level of ownership that you have in a business. Typically 50% gives you control of the business plan, greater than 75% means that you can pass special resolutions and so on. But these standard rights can be changed through what we call alternative arrangements. And what we mean by that is either contractual arrangements or the terms that apply to different securities that might be sold in that particular asset. And the contractual arrangements could be contained in a constitution or a shareholders agreement, which would really enshrine the key issues that the vendor or the seller of those of the asset wants to maintain. So councils, if they have specific objectives for an asset, they can retain or ensure that those objectives are achieved through contractual arrangements or through the terms in securities that they sell while they sell part of the business. There are positive and negative control rights. So typically it's a 50% threshold that gives you control of the business plan. That's called positive control. And then there's negative control rights, which is really veto rights over certain things as well. So it's possible for local authorities and councils to retain either positive or negative control depending on what they feel they need to own. And negative control means that they can ensure that certain things don't happen if they don't want them to happen. But ultimately what it comes down to is local authorities must first identify what it is that they consider important about the decision rights that they need around an asset, and then how they're going to codify those assets. I guess the other benefit of codifying these particular decision rights that a council wants is that they can then be measured as well. So I guess one of the observations we'd make is that there seems to be an implicit view that these decision rights are required for some reason, but they're never measured as well, so it's never clear whether the objectives are being met. In terms of value can be crystallised up front through a sale or can be taken over time through a dividend stream. And value means different things to different people. It's actually, assets are worth more to certain owners than other owners, and that's because some owners have better networks, they've got better capabilities, they may have synergies that they can access from an asset, and therefore it will perform better. Therefore there'll be more cash, therefore they'll be prepared to pay more for it. So another angle in terms of partnering with the private sector is if you can find the party that is a strategic partner in the business that can create value, then you can benefit from that value as well. So while a council may be able to sell down part of an asset to receive some capital up front, it may also actually create value through that strategic partnership over time and therefore have access to greater cash flows over time as well. And then, as I talked about, sale packages is really what's offered to potential investors. So for potential investors, obviously the decision rights are key and the economic rights are key as well. So releasing capital from CCTOs is really just one of the levers that local authorities have in terms of accessing capital and balancing the budgets. So if I was to summarise, I think councillors have a very tough job in terms of balancing these budgets. I mean, I'm glad I'm an advisor and not the councillors with the decisions that they need to make. There are 4 levers, and in reality all 4 levers need to be used. Plans will constantly change, they'll be iterative, and events and external events will require change. All revenue generating angles need to be explored, and that's the work that local government New Zealand's been doing. It's not just property taxes, there's a whole bunch of different options out there. Debt's a very valuable tool as well. It needs to form part of a funding plan. And then capital release from CCTOs, it's a viable and it's probably an underutilised option for councils. So regardless of all the sort of technical arguments around capital release, it will be emotive and emotional for councillors to make decisions around it as to whether they need to own the assets or not. Thank you.
We've had some really interesting and innovative speakers over this day in particular, and Kevin Roberts was fairly amazing to listen to. It's been interesting to sit up here and just hear a pin drop today. We know how difficult it is to make more go further with less. That's the challenge for us. The Working Party have issued this 10-point pathway. Now, this is an opening discussion document for the government and for our sector. It's embargoed until tomorrow, so that's why there have been veiled references to it, because we want to maximise the outcome of the workings and the recommendations from this funding review. I've had the benefit of sitting through these last 48 hours with a number of you from the smaller councils around the community, and although it's a matter of scale, the challenges are the same. We're all trying to find how we can sustain our communities economically going forward into the future. I enjoyed John's contribution last night. As our Prime Minister, he summed up the sense of the need for us to be working together and to, in that sense, be collaborative in the work that we do together and to have mature debates. We need a mature debate on how we fund our communities going forward. And so a word or words that John used a lot during his speech were, we matter, we really matter. We do. We're the heart and the soul of the community. Let's talk about emotional leadership, and that is really what we need to exhibit. We care about our communities and the future of our communities, and at the heart and soul of that is how we fund them, and presently the toolbox we've got is not broad enough or extensive enough to enable us to do that. I want to, on behalf of you all, to thank the three speakers, and it's my pleasure to present each of them a small token of our appreciation. First of all, Councillor Penny Webster. Next, Oliver. And last but not least, Hugo.